This is a production of Cornell University.
It has been sort of a wild ride, and it does amaze me that, just a few years ago, I was a plant pathologist and a fungal ecologist, but those themes really do translate into my current work, which really approaches the same central issues of vulnerability and of food insecurity from different and multiplicative ways. So I'm really happy to share those learnings with you and hopefully connect my work at Cornell with my work at Gain and show how these things really do build on each other and how the NGO space is a real way to build a career for us sitting in this room right now and so on. So yeah, it is a pleasure to be back here and also a unique opportunity because I defended my dissertation in the time of Zoom. And so I didn't get this chance to stand in front of my department during those days. So a really great opportunity for me in more ways than one. So today, what I'm going to be really talking about is how plant science and agricultural research in general really does have the power more broadly to shape communities and to uplift vulnerable smallholders in the context of food system transformation. So I'll share some of that with you today, but I do first want to make the argument that people are really at the very center of food systems and that they're an integral part of food systems transformation, which is not something that's vague and bureaucratic, but something that really has meaningful relevance for the lived realities of people who consume the food and produce the food and get food into the markets. So food systems really do have to work for the humans that power them. It has to work for farmers and for their families and for the system actors across food value chains that connect the farm to the dinner plate and ultimately build up meaningful livelihoods. So today, I'm going to approach these themes from a couple of different perspectives. First, the theoretical, boring one, I guess, which is sort of the definition of what is a food system and what does it mean to transform food systems, and particularly in the context of this talk, what value can be gained by applying a community lens to the task of food systems transformation. And secondly, I'll explore in a little more practical detail some methods that can be deployed for engaging communities in this process of food systems transformation. So it'll hopefully come down from the theoretical and you get to see some practical insights and approaches. And then I'll wrap up today's presentation by explaining a bit about GAIN, what we do at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and how this overall context of food systems transformation really drives our work and hopefully enables us to do right by those vulnerable consumers in the countries where we work. And I'll try to leave some time at the end for questions and discussion, although I'm notoriously bad at that. So we'll see how things go. So first, just to ground ourselves in this idea of a food system, what does that even mean? What are we talking about here? So basically a food system encompasses the myriad actions and processes that are required for the production and consumption of food. And these food systems are contextualized within certain environments like villages or states or watersheds or other units of space, but they're also contextualized within timelines that have real connection to human cultures and systems like cropping calendars and religious holidays and these sorts of things. These are all aspects of food systems. And there's this kind of reductive, but mostly useful linearization of what a food system means from the pre-production context of making sure that there are land rights and inputs and the seeds that are, that set farmers up well to produce the food that they need, all the way through production and processing and retail to that point where the food lands in the kitchen and in the pantry of the people who actually eat it. And that's the point when it can translate into nutrition outcomes. And then there's also a growing discussion around this final stage in that linear model of food waste and how much we can stand to gain in improving the functioning of our food systems by minimizing that waste and by disposing of unused or underused food properly and effectively. So that's sort of what we mean when we think about the definition of a food system. But today what I'm going to be talking about more specifically are these drivers of food systems that determine the extent to which the production and consumption of food enabled by food systems is adequate to meet nutritional needs of vulnerable populations. Food systems transformation is really this process of exacting structural change to paradigms of food production and consumption that make food systems more equitable for all actors in that food system, and that make it profitable for people who are engaged in these food value chains so that they can earn a dignified living from working the land and from perpetuating a hopefully sustainable system of production and consumption. And also transformation is about making food systems sustainable in light of unparalleled environmental degradation and climate change that is increasingly affecting the ability of food systems to nourish populations, especially in more volatile food system contexts. So continuing on a dreary train of thought, let's just explore the argument that right now food systems are enduring an unprecedented crisis. Food systems are broken and imperiled by compounding stresses. The COVID-19 pandemic, which rocked the world and importantly, supply chains for food. And furthermore, the war in Ukraine, which has upended supply chains and introduced unknown uncertainty about the availability and affordability of food for people who need it the most. And all of that together with degrading environments and increasingly volatile production contexts has meant that value chains, especially for high value perishable foods, which happen to be those that are the most nutritious and arguably the most important, have been extremely affected by all of these stresses. And the result of this sort of crisis moment for global food systems has been an undoing of much of the progress we have made to correct nutrition security, to eradicate malnutrition or to address the drivers of malnutrition. So while we had reached over the past decade a plateau in the extent of malnourishment and we're on the brink of correcting that issue, we've seen as a result of COVID and these intersecting tragedies, a resurgence of malnutrition and numerous people falling into poverty and nutrition insecurity to an extent that we haven't seen in years. So food systems are broken in a lot of ways, but that's not to say that they can't be fixed. So how do we go about fixing food systems, addressing all of these vulnerabilities? And this really is the work of food systems transformation. Really critical to the work of transformation is ameliorating power imbalances that systematically limit consumers' access to nutritious foods and producers' access to profitable and sustainable markets for those foods. So the resources really in food systems are necessary to safeguard the productive capacity of those value chains. And the way that resources are administered means a lot in terms of who has the power to influence food systems change and to what extent vulnerable people are able to participate and inform processes of food systems transformation. So what we're going to be thinking about today in the context of this talk is that particular element of power imbalance and how we can make small steps toward correcting those imbalances and giving a platform and a voice to vulnerable communities by infusing the process of food systems transformation with community-based and farmer-oriented methods that really help ensure that the agenda for food systems transformation reflects the needs of farmers and other value chain actors. So thinking a bit more about vulnerability, what does that mean and what does that look like, and what are sort of the grounds for involving people? vulnerability is really important because it constrains the potential for change. The more vulnerable you are, the more risk averse you are, and the more resistant to disrupting the status quo you might be. And it's important to note that vulnerability is not just a measure of income or monetary poverty, but it reflects this multidimensional concept of deprivation or multidimensional poverty, which includes your income, but also your access to basic infrastructure and services, and importantly, education. These things really make a difference when it comes to how empowered and emboldened food systems actors can be to take part in these processes. But also very importantly, vulnerability is, as communal and collective as it is deeply personal. And it's exactly this shared nature of vulnerability at the community level that is a foundation for collective action and really is the precedent for the potential of community-based approaches to allow food systems change to be informed by individuals. So, when we think about this, we can ask ourselves a number of questions that can help ground these challenges in human realities. When we think about how vulnerability impacts interactions with food systems, we might ask ourselves, is there a good road connecting our village to the market? Or will people take me seriously even though I never went to school? Or how can I possibly focus on nutrition when my house keeps flooding? These are just a few hypothetical examples of very real realities and vulnerabilities that exclude vulnerable but important system actors from participating in the process of food systems transformation. So with this in mind, I want to move on to sort of the main argument of the talk, which is that collective action, particularly at the community level, can be a catalyst for food systems transformation by assuaging the vulnerabilities and dispersing that risk across populations, giving vulnerable people a platform and a voice that they wouldn't ordinarily have as individual food system actors. So collective action in the context of communities basically means coming together to address shared concerns with methods that make sense in a local context. And by embracing collective action as a community, it allows a cooperative of individually vulnerable people to exert power through a number of functions. It diffuses risk across a broader number of people so that there's a comfort and security in adopting an innovation mindset. People might not feel comfortable risking their livelihood on an important food systems question or an important farming decision by themselves, but if they do it as part of a collective, that's a sort of insurance and a mechanism of support that they can rely on and trust. It also facilitates learning, where lessons learned from one farmer can meaningfully connect to the experience of others and to of entire communities, and really facilitate this atmosphere of growth and of cooperative action that can be very powerful. Collective action at the community level also reduces dependencies of vulnerable people on institutions that may not be set up well or functioning properly enough to effectively address the needs in ways that are meaningful to them. And it confers important power because there is power in numbers. And 40 farmers or 400 farmers talking about the importance of a single issue has a lot more importance than one farmer is talking about the importance of that issue. So it really does confer power for vulnerable people to shape processes of decision making. And lastly, but not least in the slightest, is that collective action is a driver of resilience. It allows communities to absorb shocks like droughts or like floods and other calamities that may otherwise jeopardize the ability of a community to produce and consume sufficiently nutritious food. So this all, I argue, is one route to food systems transformation, because through these functions and more, collective action and community-based research really does promote equitable access to markets as well as nutritious food. And it does have the promise of improving livelihood through promoting opportunities for income growth and dignified work. It does also, through its potential to embed community perspectives in the halls of power, help to influence governance at the food system scale that is responsive to communities' needs. So this is all to say that community-based research can be rather game-changing for vulnerable communities who are effectively mobilized. And I'll illustrate this with a hypothetical example. If we look at the relationship at the community level, like if all of these dots represent communities, there's a relationship between the amount of supportedness a community experiences and the amount of vulnerability they endure. And so if we, for example, embed meaningful participatory community-based research at a community level, it has the potential to reduce vulnerability and to increase the support that that community feels. And so this is, a reason why communities are very rightly seen as focal points of food systems transformation, is because there's this very real opportunity to push entire communities toward a more resilient and supportive way of life. This process of embedding community-based methods in a community can support access to markets and agricultural inputs and essential services. And I'll go into some examples later on in the talk. But before I do, I just want to also draw attention to a more insidious problem that is a perpetual challenge even for regular practitioners of community-based and participatory research, which is that there are both inter and intra-specific power imbalances that shape the way food systems transformation trickles down to the most vulnerable members of individual communities. Like if we look within a single community toward the actors who participate in these sorts of research endeavors, we can see that sometimes the ones who are most involved in the research or who have the most power to affect the trajectory of a participatory program are those that are the most entitled, that have the highest social status, perhaps meaning that the benefits of research are less felt by those who are experiencing the most vulnerability in those communities. So this is another important dimension. Traditional or classical community-based participatory research often fails to include those individuals that are the most disempowered and that ultimately stand to gain the most from that sort of project. And it really begs this question, and this is a question that's been well studied in the participatory research literature. Can community engagement really drive transformation at the community scale, especially if it doesn't include those who really stand to gain the most? So to better explore this question, I think it's useful to think about pathways that are tractable options for community engagement. And this starts the more practical part of today's presentation. So transformation at system scale can require a lot of different things, not least of which is coordinated governance, including policy influencing. And a limitation of conventional community-based participatory research is that a lot of the objectives are internal to that community, and that's important, sure, absolutely, but it also in some ways limits the potential for that research and those learnings to influence the broader agenda of food systems transformation that often spills out and includes other actors external to a particular community. So this just goes to show that translating these local insights into meaningful policy actions, especially at increasing scales, is a huge challenge and something that participatory research practitioners have not quite cracked. So perhaps it's useful to think about different ways of engaging communities on a spectrum from not transformative to super transformative, where we think of interventions where communities are not consulted in intervention design as being really not conducive to transformative action. But then we can think of classical community-based participatory research as being somewhat moderate on the spectrum of its potential for contributing to food systems transformation. In community-based participatory research, we often empower communities to independently or with necessary support address issues of local concern with methods and tactics that are valuable and important to them. But that does stop short of communicating those learnings into broader systems of knowledge and change that can result in the sort of foundation of governance required to affect meaningful and sustainable food systems transformation at scale. So this is where we think about a level of involvement of communities that positions them well to influence the way a food system is governed, and possibly the policy agenda that dictates some of those governance aspects. So I think now it's a good time to talk about a very important constraint of participatory research, which is the level of participation and the parts of the process where community members participate. Of course, there's this hugely important caveat, which is that participation is time and effort, and community members, especially those who are vulnerable for many intersecting reasons, often don't have the time or the desire to be highly engaged or overly engaged in these processes that they can sometimes see as external to them. So if we look at the outermost ring here, this is a level of involvement called empower, where we're thinking about communities leading research decision-making. And that level of empowerment is important, but it can be quite idealized. And in practice, it's very difficult to achieve a situation where at the community level, the most vulnerable are empowered to take a leading role. So the reality is that across the process of research, from design to dissemination and to partnering and so on and so forth, there are varying levels of engagement that have to be necessarily informed by the needs and desires of the community. So this is a perennial constraint of traditional community-based participatory research, because oftentimes, while the internal benefits of that research are clear and discernible to the community members, they don't often get propelled into a space where they feel that their insights translate into broader outcomes that are experienced by full food systems and that have the potential to scale. I see a question. There will be time for questions at the end, I suspect. Yeah, so with that in mind, there is hope after all, and these complex realities have resulted in a range of different techniques for engaging communities that have evolved over time. The action research discipline has a decades-long history, and over time we've really been refining and resolving many of these barriers to meaningful involvement of communities. And we've resulted in methods like participatory rural appraisal and farmer field schools, which are part of the canon of participatory research and have real evidence supporting their effectiveness in driving progress and enhancing livelihood gains and access to nutritious foods and food systems in a number of contexts. But these often do stop short of translating into longer term food systems governance realities. And so this is sort of a driver of the work that I did here at Cornell with Rebecca. And it's sort of imagining a next generation of community-based participatory research that not only embeds the process of research within communities, but also uses that research in such a way that it automatically sort of has an engagement with global knowledge systems and to be poised to make a change in a broader food systems context. So this is where an example comes in of the Farmer Research Network, or FRN, which was a core part of my dissertation research here at Cornell. We really find that farmer research networks and these aligned approaches that try and use a core of participatory research to inform a system level engagement can be very promising. And the evidence is still rather recent and new on these approaches, but we do see a lot of potential from my study and others that this is a way that we can influence outcomes that have food system scale relevance. So farmer research networks in general use networks of engaged farmers, as the name implies, across numerous geographies, sharing concerns and realities, and it really enables the farmer research network as a cooperative to be a nucleus of change and a conduit supporting the transmission of knowledge from the local into the global spaces. And this is done through building partnerships and through generating evidence and through enhancing the important agency dimension that participatory research so rightly focuses on. I think this sort of model of embedding community-based participatory research in a process of transmitting knowledge into the global innovation system has a lot of traction to amplify the influence of community engagement in food systems transformation. So just to briefly recap an example from my work here at Cornell, we established Kisan, a farmer research network in India that was really geared toward giving a collective voice to vulnerable farmers, and particularly in enabling them to address important concerns they had in preserving the grain that they depended on for their household nutrition, but also for their economic security. So during this study, we engaged farmers across 6 communities in a single state in northern India, and they co-identified grain spoilage as a foremost concern that had both nutrition consequences and real livelihood implications, because they can't sell spoiled grain to the market, which was a key source of income for them. So we did an in-home trial of hermetic grain storage, which if you've heard me speak on this stage before, you've probably heard me talk about that before. And we made sure that we weren't just giving out these sacks, but we were establishing sort of a local system that was supportive of this intervention. We partnered with local shopkeepers in the marketplace to ensure that there would be a retail supply if the demand took off for this product. And we learned that that through training and capacity building and in-home trials that allowed farmers to see the success of this product with their own eyes, there was a lot of buy-in. And we even conducted participatory cost-benefit analysis that enabled the farmers to understand that by investing in this new technology, they could profit more by reducing their the losses to insect pests and so on. So what we learned is that the technology really worked and the farmers really knew it. The farmers began seeking out the product in the market, and the FRN served as a conduit, connecting these vulnerable farmers to local governments and extension agencies in this system that seemed to have a lot of legs and a lot of merit. And it also resulted in farmers enhancing their locus of control, or the extent to which they felt that their action would actually make a difference in the processes of food system transformation. They really knew that by championing innovation in this small way, they had a say over the amount of impact they could achieve. So you can see here, it might not look very clear on the screen, but I'm comparing 2 images of what the grain stored in the hermetic sack looked like compared to a conventionally stored sack. You can perhaps make out that 90% of these grains are eaten out by insects, and you can even see the weevils in there as well. So it was just night and day difference, and the farmers really took to their new platform to advocate for change and to really be ambassadors for this technological innovation among their peers and in their communities. But I also want to tell sort of a cautionary tale that revisits the vulnerability constraints that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk too. When farmers are vulnerable to system shocks, they are very risk averse, and mindsets of risk aversion can prevent uptake of these sorts of innovations. For example, we did an estimate of the the price elasticity of demand for these hermetic sacks, which cost substantially more than the traditional methods, to see, as at increasing price points, how much, how elastic was the demand for that product? Meaning, if it cost marginally more, would there be a proportionally marginal change in the extent to which they would be willing to invest? And the moral of the story is, absolutely, there's a lot of elasticity. If it gets more expensive, they're not going to invest in it, even though they know that it's effective and they saw with their own eyes how effective it was going to be. But importantly, these two clusters represent groups of villages that are more alike to one another than they are different to one another. And these two clusters of villages express quite a high elasticity of demand. If the price increased, they would not be interested in investing in it. But the third cluster had much less elastic demand, meaning that whatever we were doing really worked in those communities. And this is a really interesting cautionary tale, but also an inspiring one, because it shows that, if the communities really buy into it, they can, with enough support and with a spirit of collective action, really buy into the idea and choose to invest in it. So yeah, just to finish up by saying that communities have specific needs that map to their specific context. There's no silver bullet. And this is exactly why community-based approaches can reveal a lot of the nuances and why innovation does or doesn't take on. So with the last few minutes of my talk, and I know I'm running short on time and I want to leave time for discussion, I just want to give a bit of an overview about what GAIN is and what we are trying to do at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. So GAIN is a Swiss-based organization headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, that was founded in 2002. And our vision as an organization is healthier diets for all, especially the most vulnerable, and that emerge from food systems that are more sustainable in light of environmental challenges. And the mission of our organization is to improve the consumption of healthy diets for all, especially the most vulnerable, by improving the availability, affordability, desirability, and sustainability of nutritious and safe food. And my role in the organization is the technical officer for Reaching the Very Poor and the program lead for social protection, which I'll talk about in a moment. So you can see that my work is specifically targeting the most vulnerable, which is central to our organization's mission. In terms of what GAIN does in the general sense, we have a number of diverse programs that are focused broadly on making food systems work for everyone. And they're organized around 3 goals: impact, sustainability, and scale, which I suspect are quite straightforward. And we have cross-cutting themes that really underpin all of our work, including gender, environment, and the inclusion of the very poor. And we have 4 programmatic clusters that serve as an umbrella that our work generally operates within, and we will give you a good idea of just what we're about. We do a lot of large-scale food fortification, so fortification of food with micronutrients. We support small and medium enterprises in nutrition through our Nutrition Enterprise Unit to ensure that nutrition is a business and that value chains are supported to potentiate access to nutritious and safe foods. We do a lot of work in driving food systems change, which is where I fall into the organization. And we also have a huge presence of policy and governance related work as well. And we work across a number of countries, having country offices in particularly Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia. Now I'll just spend a couple minutes talking about specifically my program, which is social protection. So at GAIN, we really think about social protection as transformative programs and policies that aim to alleviate the adverse effects of poverty and to reduce social inequities. And many examples of social protection you're probably already familiar with, like direct cash transfer programs or in-kind nutrition support, like school meals or food vouchers. There are also social protection benefits in terms of or underemployment and social security. And then there is a growing body of examples of social protection that are driven toward financial inclusion and human capital development. And so as part of the organization, and I, as the program lead in this area, am tasked with understanding how this general theme fits into our broader purpose of making nutritious diets accessible to those who are experiencing poverty. What we do in our social protection program is work through evidence-based engagement with a number of partners. GAIN, being an alliance and an alliance builder, is really driven by the idea of partnership to achieve our shared aims. So we work a lot with governments and private sector stakeholders and other partners, particularly to amplify community perspectives, to leverage social protection as a transformative and livelihood supporting activity. Also to mainstream the use of social protection mechanisms as catalysts of positive nutrition behavior change. And we're also taking advantage of our history as an organization, touching on value chains to make sure that social protection systems talk to and integrate with value chains for nutritious foods to ensure that governments are able to supply and enhance access to nutritious foods through value chains-based approaches. And then importantly, we're trying to facilitate crosstalk between country contexts in sort of South-South learning coalitions to ensure that the successes and learnings from the social protection experience for nutrition impact in countries are shared and that we can synergize and learn from one another. So just to wrap up, I'll say that it's not an altogether dissimilar pathway to food systems transformation than what I've been working on at Cornell and in the space of community-based participatory research. The functions of social protection for vulnerable communities are rather resembling the functions of collective action if it's done properly and in a way that is really true to the spirit of community empowerment. I think I will leave it there, and I hope we have some time for questions, but I do want to acknowledge a number of folks, especially Rebecca, for the continued support, and the broader SIPS faculty and students, as well as the Tata Cornell Institute and DNS and the Program of International Nutrition at Cornell. And of course, very grateful to GAIN and particularly our program services team, of which I'm a part, for enabling me to do all this work. And most importantly, perhaps, to all the farmers and communities who drive this work and will continue to inform our agenda in food systems transformation. So thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you got involved working with GAIN and what your path coming out of Cornell into GAIN was like. You always have a thought that you would go into the NGO space coming into grad school. Just maybe elaborate a little bit more on that for those of us who are just interested.
Sure.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, very good question. So the question was about how I got into GAIN and whether I always knew that I wanted to go the NGO route when I was navigating grad school and the great beyond. The answer to that question is no. Actually, I had no intention of going into the NGO space. I fully thought I would be another Rebecca Nelson, frankly. So it was sort of a surprise to me, but I've always been driven more by the work than the organization or the sector. Throughout my time at Cornell, I really learned about and invested in the idea of community empowerment in the context of international agricultural development. And for me, it wasn't important to whether I would do that work in a university context or in an NGO space, but rather, what is the amount of impact I can have for those vulnerable beneficiaries? And I ultimately found that the work GAIN was doing was a great path toward that on-the-ground impact. Yeah, great question.
Anthony, I wonder if you could go back to the slide where you had those three communities who had elastic and inelastic
Sure.
responses, and say a little bit more about them and what caused the elasticity or the inelasticity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you? Yeah.
Sure.
Question for the post on Zoom.
Yeah. So the question was, with respect to these three communities or village clusters, what resulted in this difference in the elasticity of demand that we observed? There were a number of factors. I think the most contributive factors included the fact that in this cluster, the local leaders of the FRN were very vocal and they bought into the idea. And the way that these communities worked meant that the local leaders were entrusted with sort of driving the agenda, and many of the farmers really mobilized together on the, in alignment with the farmers that they knew and trusted. And I think the fact that in this village cluster we had really vocal leaders who bought into the idea, they drove the whole operation, and it was really beautiful to see. Whereas the leadership was less strong in the other two clusters. But it is also, I think, very much related to the production system, the cropping systems, which I think you all as an audience would appreciate. The cluster that exhibited the least elasticity of demand was the cluster that primarily produced rice and wheat in rotation. And we primarily advocated for the use of these hermetic sacks in rice and wheat, particularly wheat. And so the fact that those crops were so major as drivers of those local economies, I think played a huge role. Whereas in these two clusters, which had a different cropping system that included more diverse crops like maize and like groundnuts, which were not as conducive to being stored with this technology, that probably resulted in it. Overall, it boils down to local leaders and the proportional share of wheat to the local economy. Yeah, great question. Hope that answers it. Yeah.
Question. So I guess my question is just around like the role of like an organization like GAIN or someone who's like coming as an outsider perspective, and like how can they best like sort of support like communities and being community driven when they are sort of like, I don't know, in some ways like set against that as like someone who's coming in with privilege or someone who is like not a part of that community.
Yeah, very good question. I'll repeat the question or paraphrase, hopefully I get it right. So the question was regarding how we as an organization, as GAIN, approach this idea of us coming into these community contexts as outsiders or with privilege, and sort of having that external presence in a community space. This is a very real challenge, and I think one that's shared across all organizations in the development sector. How do we empower the local agenda to be the driver of the global agenda? And that's a really tough question. The way that I've really approached it in my work is by advocating for the empowerment of our local country-based teams and making sure that at the country level we build up the capacity in partnership with governments and other stakeholders. So it's not just GAIN coming in and doing some such thing, it's actually GAIN coming in and supporting this more transformative action that will hopefully have resounding and scalable effects in the context of the broader local policy agenda. But it is a major challenge, and at some level, development orgs are always seen as outsiders when they step into a community, but that's not always a bad thing. In fact, it holds a lot of promise sometimes. Yeah.
So, Anthony, you emphasized here sort of working at community level and community members as part of transformative change. That's sort of the emphasis that I heard here. And yet when I hear Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and I'm wondering who's in the alliance, I mean, are you not also acting at the sort of policy, highest level of policy? Also, when we were chatting last night, I was hearing, very high level policymakers involved in your current, daily work. You're in DC, you're moving and shaking at the highest levels of, heads of state types or their immediate deputies. And how do you bridge that? Because when I think of structural change or transformation in general, I'm like A to B is like a structure A to structure B. who's changing what are we even talking about? Sometimes it seems very abstract, and how do you get the highest level and the policy level and the community members on the same page or achieving that?
Yeah.
I don't even understand what the transformation is and how it's being achieved, but can you come in sort of the daily work at Gain that you're doing now and how you
Sure.
those ends of the spectrum?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's no like easy answer to it, but the overall sense that I've gotten, and the one that I try to use in my work, is that when we work with policymakers and people that wield power, we should be focused on making them aware of community needs and giving them actionable models by which to make their power work for people at community level. And it's a tough challenge, because people that are mired in institutional bureaucracies are often rather resistant to thinking at the granular human level. But for example, in my work in the social protection program, we are really committed to this idea of human-centered design, making sure that we understand how social protection mechanisms impact people, and we sort of help the people who make decisions about the design and delivery of these programs respond to those particular needs. It's not, we want to get away from the idea of these government agencies or what have you making decisions that they think will work for the communities. We want to instead empower those government agencies to meaningfully listen and address the needs of those communities through raising human-centered design questions as an option for them, and through developing forums whereby policymakers can sit face-to-face with beneficiaries and understand their concerns in a way that leads to policy action. So that's sort of the way I describe it. Yeah.
A question following on that, does GAIN intersect or interact directly with program managers at major federal funding agencies? And if not, do you think that would be practical and effective?
Yeah, so the question was regarding whether GAIN interacts with like federal funding agencies, and if not, or if, would that be effective or meaningful? The answer is yeah. We do a lot of interaction, and like any organization, we are always driven by sort of the evolving priorities of countries and donors and the broader, context of need in the nutrition space. And so, we operate with a lot of donors' priorities in mind, and often those donor priorities are reflective of country governments' priorities. And, we take a lot of this multilateral feedback into account. But I think it is a particular strength of GAIN that we are so driven toward partnerships, and we have really nice and trusting relations with a lot of actors in governments, and particularly in the countries where we work, that can help support those sorts of things. Yeah.
That's another question.
Sure.
So what are the local offices? What do those actually look like? Who's staff there? Do you actually hire local community members to staff those offices? And then how do those offices communicate with your office in Switzerland, I believe?
Mm-hmm.
So what's that actually look like boots on the ground, sort of?
Yeah, well, I must say that our country offices are way more lively and exciting than our what we call our representative offices, I think. Yeah, so we have country offices in 10 or so countries, and they have really robust staff that do very important programming work and project management, and they are the boots on the ground. And more often than not, they are local staff, which is, I think, really powerful. That we're not transplanting folks into these places; we're investing in that local capacity. And so, yeah, our country offices look very much like any business in those cities, in those countries, and it's actually rather inspiring.
Would you mind saying a little bit more on who's in the alliance, and a little bit about the history of the alliance, and sort of what's on your sort of hot, your front burner at the moment?
Sure. So I don't have a clear answer for like who is the alliance, but I think that is rooted in our history, sort of from the moment we emerged, it probably was more of a defined alliance in those days. But now the alliance, as far as I interpret it, is more about, a commitment to alliance building and to investing in these partnerships. Engagement and partnership really drives our work. So even though possibly in the early days of GAIN, it was a definable alliance, now it is really sort of a testament to our way of working that really is driven by partnerships and alliance building. Yeah.
Your current hot burner issues would be, how would you describe your sort of current battles or main thing that you're up to?
Oh, well, right now I'm in the throes of setting up a really big program in 4 Asian countries and 2 African countries, and it's gotten me quite excited. I'm pursuing a lot of the material that I described in the slide about what our social protection program does. We're setting up interventions on, using social protection as a mechanism for nutrition behavior change, and we're using we're partnering with self-help groups in India, for example, to understand how connection to social protection systems can be an opportunity for livelihood gains and income generation. And so we're doing a number of these things. And so my day-to-day life is very full of setting up all of that. Yeah.
Do you see your just understanding of participatory research, well, not pharma participatory, but just general community participatory research, sort of being relevant in the work that you do now? So you said that you're planning on intervention strategies. Do you see participatory research as a means to get you that information and sort of guide you through what intervention would work?
Yeah, very good question. So the question was about whether and to what extent possibly I see participatory research elements finding their way into my current work and whether that seems useful. I would say yes, very much so. We, in our interventions, won't be necessarily doing community-based participatory research in that classical sense, but in as far as we are invested in amplifying beneficiary voice and committed to human-centered design, we are using a lot of those same themes to try and understand how we give a platform to those vulnerable people and how we articulate their narratives in ways that are meaningful both to them and for the broader policymaking environment and for the social protection system. So I would say, yeah, the skills I gained at Cornell are very much applicable to what I'm doing now, and that is a PSA. Yeah.
We're about out of time, and if does anybody have a last question, or should we give Anthony another thanks?
Thanks for having me.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.